Hello, everybody. I'm Christopher Allen with Allen Interactions, and we're going to have a fun 25-minute conversation about learning science. And I'm excited to be joined by a couple of folks who know a lot more about learning science than I do. And we're really excited to have Clark Quinn with us today. And if you're interested in finding out more about Clark and his work, you can find him on Twitter. He's Quinnovator, or Quinnovation is his website. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Michael Allen to kick us off with kind of our first question and question stem here on learning science.
Okay, well, it's certainly a treat to be on camera with Clark Quinn. He is one of our most prominent thought leaders in the field that's been working for a long time, and he has a lot to teach us and has been in some wonderful books. So I really appreciate your work, Clark. So there are so many common intuitive thoughts about learning and teaching, and I'm struck by how many of them are not well-founded. In fact, as you know, with your own book about those myths, and I just turned around, looked at my library, and I quickly pulled out a couple of books. One of them is Myths in Education, and the other one is Urban Myths about learning and education. It's such a rich topic. You can write countless numbers of books about these things, of how the intuitive thoughts about how we learn and how we best transmit knowledge and how we help others build it, they're just so voluminous that we need some guidance. And so turning to science seems like makes a lot of sense.
It's 4 o'clock.
What do we mean by learning science? What's that entail, Clark?
Well, it's actually a relatively new field in a sense, compared to things like physics, which has been around a lot longer. But it emerged when people realized, they were interested in learning as a cognitive phenomenon. But they realized lots of different places were doing different types of studies that were all about learning. So in educational psychology and cognitive science and sociology, all these different places are looking at certain. So they established a conference and a journal about learning science. And, it's pretty obvious that it's the scientific study of learning. But it's trying to identify what are the constants, what changes, what situations we learn in. And you're exactly right, Michael, that we have so much folk psychology about learning that's just wrong. The notion of highlighting, the notion that we can identify and should teach to learners individual styles. There's a bunch of stuff that we find isn't true. And then, so we need to find the stuff that is true. Things like, the importance of practice, spacing practice, the right level of desirable difficulty in practice. These are the things that matter. And yet we struggle to build into our practices.
We sure do. I have to just anecdotally tell you that I know these things make a huge difference. And when way back in 1965, I took my first college course in psychology. One of the things that I learned is that if you get too comfortable when you're trying to learn, you learn less well than when you're a bit uncomfortable. And I thought, that's really weird, but I'm going to try this out. So I started studying in the dorm on my knees. I would get to the side of my bunk bed and I'd put my books on the bed, and it doesn't take very long to get tired. I'm not a baseball catcher, but obviously, but it doesn't take long to get really kind of uncomfortable when you're on your knees. And I found that, wow, I really focused. I really focused. I actually made the room too cold too, so I was uncomfortable in multiple ways. I really focused. It shortened my learning time, and I felt like my learning increased. So a lot of the things we think intuitively, as we're saying here, about how to learn are just wrong. And who would think putting your body at stress would help you in cognitive learning, but it turns out to. So we really need to turn to it.
Well,
So, yeah. So what are the things we need to apply to course development for building courses? Are there some highlights of science that that people really need to know?
Well, absolutely. Learning science should influence how we do L&D practices, and that starts with courses, which is most of what we do. As I was saying, getting practice right and realizing practice. I like to say learning naturally is action and reflection. We do things and we can learn sort of subconsciously, but we accelerate it when we consciously reflect and think about it and add it to our repertoire, which then implies that instruction should be designed action and guided reflection. And yet what we see, and you've railed against this, no more boring e-learning, is one of the Allen Interactions mantras. Instead, we do a information dump and a knowledge test. And that's not going to lead to any new ability to do. So courses are certainly the first place. And, this goes everything from, and fortunately, learning science goes beyond just the cognitive to the emotional and affective as well. So we need to hook people in emotionally beforehand. So our introductions need to be different. We need to know about what are useful content to provide, what are conceptual models and just, worked examples, designing the right practice. All of this are important aspects of learning science that we could and should be applying to what we do. And we're not seeing it. I think there are challenges to getting people to shift to this new approach. I'm beginning to believe we're getting there. And Michael, you and I and Julie Dirksen Woltalheimer joined to try and help raise awareness with our Serious E-Learning Manifesto. And it's still struggling to get that going. And yet it does, it was a nice way to highlight the differences. And thank you for the inspiration on doing that.
What do you think? This is a question to both of you. So if learning science, which seems like the right thing that should be influencing our work, isn't influencing our work, what seems to be pushing our practice more than anything else?
I'll jump in first. I'd say legacy models. Most of us have been brought up in school where we listened to our teachers talk to us and write on the blackboard and had us read passages in our textbooks and then gave us a quiz. And so many people have had their thinking about how to teach shaped by that. And so they keep replicating this model that was never really very good. It has certain efficiencies to it, of course, when you can bring students together and you have just one teacher and you end up doing pretty much the same thing for all students, whether it's the right thing to do for any student or not, you're never particularly sure. But I think the thing that influences us most is what we got used to in school, and it's hard to shake that off.
It is. I will agree and add two other factors I think are important. Yes, if it looks like school, then it must be learning, right? We get a lot of that. But we also had, we create learning, we had pressure starting in, as an outcome of 911, nobody wanted to travel. So they started putting everything online. And there were incredible pressures to do it fast and cheap. So this model of putting content up on adding a quiz that looks like school was even more concentrated, even more emphasized. And the other factor I want to add in is, and we don't measure impact. We don't go in and look at whether our manipulations really are changing anything in the organization. As long as we don't, we won't have any idea what we're doing is useful or not. So I think the fact that we have a lack of measurement allows us to continue, even if I think Michael's right that the gestation of the problem comes from school. And actually, the history of schools is interesting. It started, the Prussian military started being the one to put people sit down and listen, and even locked them into place. to force them to listen, when apprenticeships of being in a culture of doing had been the original way we developed before we created schools. What I heard Alan Kay speak, he's one of my heroes, and he gave a talk about how there were these human universals that cultural anthropologists found. Two that weren't part of every culture were schooling and science. And, so we've created schooling, and we've done it for, as you said, Michael, for efficiency. And yet it's not really a very natural way to learn. And we need to get back to how our brains really learn.
That's right. Science is difficult in our field, probably difficult in all fields, but in our field, so many studies have been done under very controlled situations. But the delivery of instruction is often occurring in varied situations, and so I have a very good friend of mine who is a scientist, and he reminds me, he said, the best scientists are the ones who are the most skeptical of scientific findings. Yeah, I think that's interesting because, a novice scientist will do one little study, find something, and proclaim to the world that we now understand something in depth, Whereas we have to, in fact, pulling off another book from the library, I love this one, The Follies of Science. And this is a history of well-known scientific facts that have turned out to be totally incorrect. So they're not always right. You and I have a really good friend in Will Thalheimer, who is looking at the science continuously. And I was telling him one time that when I hire an instructional designer, I have to get them to unlearn some things before I feel like they can do what works best. And one of the things that they tend to do is to start out with the basics, the terminology, the history of this field, and so forth. And a lot of that stuff is boring, as you were mentioning, and you don't get to the interesting part until the end of the course. And so, what I ask my designers to do is put an interesting problem or a situation in front of learners right at the beginning, and get them actively trying to find a solution. And then we give the instruction by giving them hints and guidance along the way. Say, try this, and this might work. We might even give them a hint to try something that isn't a good idea, but we want them to see what's going to happen when they do that, And so I was telling Will about this one day, and he said, "Where'd you come up with that?" I said, "From experience. It's just from experience. I've seen it work over and over and over again." And he said, "Well, I'd like to tell you, my dear friend, there is science that supports that approach." So sometimes, good guidance just comes from a lot of experience. And sometimes it comes from scientific study. And the best is when they agree. They just come together, right?
I love triangulation, where you get multiple ways of finding out that something is true. And indeed, I look another one of my friends, the scientist in educational psych, and he promotes design research approach, where you try and approach a real problem, you apply the best learning theories to it, you iterate until you get a solution, then you reflect on what that means for what you thought about what learning theory was. Yeah. As a practical way to address the problem you were raising, Michael, about how our experiments tend to be too controlled. And yet education in organizations and in schools and everywhere else tends to be at least somewhat close to chaotic environments.
Yeah.
You're both touching on things that don't necessarily sound like typical courses. But I think, Clark, one of the things that you've written about is that it doesn't just apply to the things that we might think of as a formal course, and that is learning the practice that someone should be following isn't just build more courses that are generally more effective, but there's other things that you can do, maybe even when your budget is tight and you can't actually afford to build a course, that's still rooted in learning science.
Well, that's exactly right. Our needs as learners change. So when we're novices, when we don't know what we need to know, we don't know why it's important, courses make sense. But as we begin to start doing the work, we start knowing what we need, we know why it's important, we just need it. So you just want to switch to a more resource-based approach, and you begin to start needing other people to engage with. You can always benefit from mentoring and coaching, but also just talking with others, exploring how they look at it and enriching yourself that way. That's sort of informal learning. Well, of course, once you become an expert, there isn't anybody who can tell you how to do it. What you need to do and want to do is continue to interact with other people, create a friction to expand the knowledge of the field as a whole. So, and these principles of learning are based upon the same core of how our cognitive architecture works. Our wetware doesn't change. You know, we haven't changed to a lower level of attention of a goldfish. Evolution doesn't work that quickly. That's a myth. But how it adapts, how it builds, depending on your level of knowledge and your ability to scaffold, and even learning to learn is not completely pre-fixed. We can adjust that. So the principles of learning go well beyond to informal learning. And also, you know, when our brain works, when should we not try and put it in the head? When should we put information in the world? Because it's crazy to try and put it in our head. Our heads are not great at remembering rote and arbitrary and large quantities of abstract information. Why would we want to try and put that in, except when we absolutely have to, like medical vocabulary?
Right.
So who should be aware of this stuff? I think, you know, it's pretty easy to see that learning and development professionals really should have a strong rooting in their own practice of learning science and be able to wield it. But that's probably not enough to get over some of these barriers that both of you talked about, as why learning science isn't influencing the types of courses that we're creating, because we're comfortable. We all know what school looks like, right? And so it seems like the sphere of people inside an organization that should really have some more than awareness of learning science needs to be outside of just the L&D department.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that, you know, in some sense, everybody should have some awareness of learning science, because everybody should be wanting to learn more, to be improved, to be better informed, better able, more capable. But when we, you know, I realize that can seem sort of trite and trivial. Besides designers, I think their managers and executives really need to understand learning, at least to a level where they're not thinking that learning looks like school. They need to understand how learning really works, at least at a top level. I think organization development people who want to make systemic change in people's behaviors have to understand something about learning science so that they are capable of doing that. And coaches and mentors, and I do believe coaching and mentoring are worthwhile initiatives for organizations to undertake specifically. In fact, I knew a colleague who was in a L&D department, and they wouldn't develop a course where they also didn't develop the manager training to be coaches to continue to keep that behavior changing as it was put in the workplace, instead of getting extinguished as they fall back to the old ways. So there's a lot of need for this, at least in anybody making decisions about learning investments, learning programs. You know, how do you know that you shouldn't invest in learning and you should be investing in job aids at this point if you don't really understand when that makes sense? And that comes down to basically an understanding of our brains.
I have the adage that success always comes from people doing the right thing at the right time. And so if you're an organizational leader, or even a family, in a family, you want your kids doing the right thing. You want yourself doing the right things at the right time. But if you've got a whole bunch of people relying on you as a leader for the group to be successful so they continue to have their jobs and their income, we need to be learning all the time so that we can be successful. the competition between companies really all boils down to who's got the best performing workforce. So it's critical. And yet, as we're saying here, so many people assume that what happened to them in school must be good enough. Well, it isn't good enough today. Things move too fast. Our knowledge changes too fast. We require great levels of efficiency that we never did before. So I want to mention the Allen Academy because we are so proud, Clark, to have you among the faculty members there. We feel that the whole field of instructional design and development hasn't attained the professional status that it really ought to have. There's a lot to know. And as we've said in this discussion, much of it is counterintuitive. So you really need to study and you really need to practice. But we've also realized there are a lot of people who aren't destined to become professionals in this field, but need to be good managers, good leaders, good organization developers, good buyers of training. And so we're developing a number of standalone courses that people can take in order to prepare themselves to make good decisions. And I'm delighted that you're teaching in the academy. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that, Michael. You triggered a thought, and so I'm afraid I can't let us finish until I get this off my chest. But you were talking about, organizations need to be better performing, and I argue as a response to the question Christopher asked about, is it beyond courses? I think optimal execution, doing the things we know we need to do, is only going to be the cost of entry going forward. Continual innovation is going to be the only true differentiator. And to me, innovation is learning. When you do research or problem solving or design, you don't know the answer when you start. That is learning too. And that's why learning science definitely goes beyond the course. It's absolutely critical to getting courses that actually have an impact. But it's also going to be key to understanding how to facilitate us learning together when we work as teams to try and solve problems that the organization needs to figure out to be successful and to figure out new products, new services. So that's the opportunity that to me is interestingly on the table when we talk about learning beyond the course.
Fantastic. I've put two resources in the comments. So if you're, no matter what platform you happen to be watching us on, there's a link to one of Clark's more recent blogs discussing learning science. So there's an opportunity for you to read a little bit more about his thoughts. And then we're currently displaying, and also in the comments, is a link to a course that we've got in partnership with HR.com. That's coming up in a few weeks. And if you go to HR.com /L2, you'll find out more about this learning science course and get an opportunity to learn directly from Clark.
Great. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you both. I appreciate it.
This is great. And of course, you can find also a lot more about the eLearning Manifesto at elearningmanifesto.org. All right. Well, thank you both. This was a fun conversation.
Thank you.
We'll do it again. Thanks.